due to high nutrient inputs from agricultural or urban activities, or contamination, such as metal pollution from mining activities. Previous studies demonstrate that metal pollution can have negative effects on aquatic organisms, and that these organisms can bioaccumulate metals through the direct absorption of water and or by breathing. Now, I'm going to focus on the importance of fish swimming and its relationship with flow. As I mentioned before, water velocity can determine the habitat using fish, and this can be partly explained by fish swimming capabilities. Moreover, fish swimming can also be related to other ecological processes, including survival, food capture, migration, and reproduction. So, fish swimming is strongly related to fitness of fish populations in streams. In addition, swimming performance in fish can be classified into three different categories: sustained, prolonged, and bull swimming. While sustained and prolonged swimming entails steady movements, bull swimming entails unsteady movements. Depending on the body shape of the species, individuals tend to maximize steady or either steady or unsteady movements. In addition, swim tunnel respirometers are commonly employed because this type of equipment allows us to determine swimming capacity, but also to measure oxygen consumption rates during fish exercise. Because oxygen is involved in the production of adenosine phosphate, oxygen consumption rates are considered good indicators of the energetic requirements of the animals. Following on another aspects involving fish in streams, previous studies demonstrate that fishes can strongly influence or modify the physical habitat of the streams through biota, including activities such as nest digging, foraging, and movement. Moreover, fishes can also influence the nutrient cycle through the total control, but also through the separation of nutrients, thereby increasing the nutrient concentrations and water and altering the stoichiometric flow of the levels. However, fish effects are often context-dependent, since some aggressive stressors, such as high water flows or eutrophication, can attenuate fish influx. So, the main aim of this thesis was to assess the responses of the stream biota to flow alterations in terms of water velocity increments and reductions of discharge and to metal pollution. This thesis encompassed aquatic respirometry experiments to test for the effects of flow velocity on the physiological responses of aquatic fishes. Moreover, we also performed field mesophos experiments using the Mediterranean Barus meridionalis to test this species as a modulator of the responses of periphyton and macroinvertebrates to reductions of discharge and metal pollution. Let's move on to the method for aquatic respirometry. In total, we collect 8 fish species, including Catalan chat, common rock, common bleak, sandfish, Mediterranean barbel, and minnow, using the electrofishing method. Moreover, we collect individuals of the standstill carp from Lampeteras and marshes, and we use information regarding swimming capacity and metabolic rates of mosquito fish from our previous study. Once at the university, we held in aquarium, active with oxygen and filtration systems. We use a natural photoperiod, and fishes were fed every day with frozen milk bottles. We basically use 2 different types of swim tunnel respirometers. A large one of 5 kilos of capacity was used for the larger species such as cyprinids, whereas a smaller one of 170 milliliters of capacity was used for the smaller species such as Spanish tooth carp and mosquito fish. In both cases, there was a propeller inside the swimming chamber that generated the flow, and it was connected to outside electric motor. There were also a temperature curve, an optical fever sensor for the recording of oxygen concentrations in water. Moreover, there was a pump placed in the water bath to replace the water inside the swimming chamber. To determine monitoring performance, we follow the critical swimming speed protocol, or UCRIT, which consists of stepwise increases in flow using intervals of 20 minutes until the fish fatigue. These absolute values of critical swimming speed were then divided by the standard length of fish to get the relative critical swimming speed in body length per second. During the swimming 3 hours, oxygen consumption rates were measured using intermittent flow respirometry, which are series of short-term closed respirometry interrupted by phases of flushing to replace the water inside. We then used or calculate the rotations as logs derived from the relationship between oxygen consumption and time to estimate the oxygen consumption rates or metabolic rates. We then use these oxygen consumption rates to estimate important metabolic rates that describes the bounds of the fish respiratory capacity. Maximum metabolic rate was defined as the highest oxygen consumption rate during the swimming period, whereas at the opposite metabolic scale, a standard metabolic rate, or SMR, it's the minimum energy expenditure of an animal to sustain life. We fit exponential functions from the oxygen consumption rate and swimming speeds to calculate the standard metabolic rate. We use the parameter A of the exponential function as an estimation of the standard metabolic rate at zero swimming speed. The difference between maximum metabolic rate and standard metabolic rate gives the absolute aerobic scope, which represents the overall capacity for oxygen supply to the tissues, and therefore it gives information about an animal's capacity to simultaneously perform oxygen-demanding tasks, such as growth or reproduction. Regarding the swimming efficiency, we calculate the mass specific cost of transport by dividing the oxygen consumption rates, by the corresponding speed and the body mass of the fish. At the end of each experiment, the individuals were photographed and some morphometric ratios were calculated using the TPS DLG software. These morphometric ratios were binary ratio, which is a predictor of maximum probability swimming speed. That is, individuals with streamlined bodies minimize drag forces. Caudal peduncle depth factor, which is a predictor of the capacity of fish to generate more cover and propulsion using the caudal peduncle. Propulsive ratio, which is a predictor of the swimming ability of fish due to greater muscle and propulsion areas. And finally, muscle ratio, which is a predictor of the capacity of fish to sustain itself in rapid and turbulent waters. So the third chapter was entitled Differences in Swimming Performance and Energetic Cost between an endangered toothcarp of Anopsivirus and an invasive mosquito fish Gambusia colbrocki. This work was published in Ecology of Freshwater Fish. The main objective of this study were to determine prolonged swimming speeds and metabolic rates of Anopsivirus and compare swimming performance and energy use between Anopsivirus and Gambusia colbrocki in relation to morphological aspects. We performed analysis of the covariance using body mass as a covariant, species and sex on the response variables. Here you can see that there were significant differences between species, and also the species sex term interaction was found to be significant for the critical swimming speed. The scatter plot below shows the relationship between critical swimming speed and body mass. And you can see that males of Gambusia colbrocki have higher critical swimming speed than females of Gambusia colbrocki, and both sexes of Anopsivirus showing the lowest values of critical swimming speed. These differences in swimming capabilities between the two species agree with their habitat use. While Anopsivirus is mainly found in slow-moving waters, mosquito fish can also be found in downstream reaches, where water velocity is expected to be higher. Moreover, the observed differences between sexes of Gambusia colbrocki could be related to the acute sexual dimorphism of this species, as previous studies suggest. In addition to critical swimming speed, we found significant differences between species for maximum metabolic rate, aerobic scope, and cost of transport, and species sex-time interaction correspond to a significant maximum metabolic rate and aerobic score. Here you can see that Aphaniocereus have higher maximum metabolic rate and aerobic score than males of Gambusa horrocki, and finally females of Gambusa horrocki, showing the lowest values. So these results indicate that the native species Aphaniocereus would have more energy budget to simultaneously perform oxygen-demanding activities, including growth, digestion, and reproduction. Moreover, we found that Gambusa horrocki have lower values of cost of transport than Aphaniocereus for a given body mass, indicating that Gambusa horrocki display less energy consumption per meter zoom. Moreover, the other plot shows means of mass-specific cost of transport in relation to swimming speed in body length per second. While Gambusa horrocki shows similar mass-specific cost of transport for a wider range of swimming speeds, it seems that the Aphaniocereus have higher mass-specific cost of transport at lower speeds. These differences in swimming efficiency could be related to differences in swimming mechanics, which means that the two species might differ in the way that they use their body parts for swimming. However, further studies are needed to confirm this hypothesis. What we demonstrate in this study is that the two species differ in morphological traits. Gambusa horrocki have higher fine ratio, and males of Gambusa horrocki have higher caudal peduncle depth factor. Moreover, we found positive associations between fine ratio and critical swimming speed, and a negative association between caudal peduncle depth factor and cost of transport. So, we conclude that the more streamlined body and thinner caudal peduncle of mosquito fish allow this species to maintain position longer against water flow, but also to reduce swimming cost because of lower drag forces. The second chapter was entitled Site-Related Effects and the Influence of Metabolic Rates and Morphology on Swimming Performance in Fish. This work was published in Current Zoology. The main objectives of this study were to examine intra- and interspecific variation in swimming performance and energy metabolism after accounting for body size, and investigate to what extent interspecific variation in swimming performance is explained by a suite of morphological and physiological traits. To assess interspecific variation within the same species, we performed simple and multiple regression models using body mass, total length, maximum metabolic rate, and standard metabolic rate as independent variables. In general, we found that body mass was largely the best predictor of critical swimming speed, standard metabolic rate, and maximum metabolic rate. However, predictive models using a second predictor in addition to body mass significantly increase the explained variation. For instance, as for the Mediterranean model, you can see that predictive models using body mass and total length explain 61% of the variation, whereas a simple regression model using only body mass explains 44% of the variation. Body size also influences the metabolic rates across individuals of the same species. The higher is the body mass, the higher is the oxygen consumption rate in relation to swimming speed. However, and interestingly, the value of the speed exponent tend to decrease with increasing body mass, indicating that heavier fish have more efficient swimmers. Regarding the interspecific variation across species, we found positive relationships between standard metabolic rate and maximum metabolic rate, and a positive relationship between critical swimming speed and maximum metabolic rate. However, we found that there exists high interspecific variation in metabolic rates, even after these ones, metabolic rates, were standardized to the mean of body mass. This high interspecific variation across species could be related to the ecological life of a species. For instance, the study of Stoffels demonstrates that pelagic species tend to have higher metabolic rates than benthopelagic and benthic species. Moreover, we found positive relationships between aerobic swimming performance and two morphometric ratios, such as muscle ratio and fine ratio, reflecting a gradient of performance described by pumpkin seed, tooth count, mosquito fish, and subunits. We conclude that the variation in critical swimming speed among the species can be partly explained by the variation in the relative rates of maximum metabolic rate, muscle ratio, and fine ratio. Finally, I would like to show you this plot showing the means of muscle-specific cost of transport, because we interestingly found that the pumpkin seed, which is represented by red squares, show similar or even lower muscle-specific cost of transport than some subunits with more fusiform values. It seems that this species could compensate hydrodynamic disadvantages at low speeds. However, previous studies suggest that hydroarchmorphs can compensate the higher energetic costs due to hydrodynamic disadvantages because these species have lower standard metabolic rate. However, in this thesis, we found that pumpkin seed have similar SMR than the other species. It's also worth mentioning that hydroarchmorphs tend to increase sharply the metabolic rates as swimming speed increases compared to lower archmorphs. Let's move on to the methods for free-mesocause experiments. We perform a mesocause experiment in the Girona stream, which is a calcareous stream with a length of 32 kilometers and a drainage area of 185 square kilometers. This stream is affected by eutrophication and by the presence of a well that causes water intermittency downstream. So we perform a mesocause experiment in both upstream and downstream from the well to test for the effects of long periods of dryness on ecosystem structure and function. The other experiment was performed in the stream, which is a small siliceous stream with a length of 24 kilometers and a drainage area of almost 89 square kilometers. This stream is characterized by having a well-developed riparian vegetation. However, it's impacted by some anthropogenic stressors, such as elevated phosphate concentrations, efficient nutrient removal of wastewater treatment plant located upstream. Also, the presence of a well causes reductions in discharge downstream, and most importantly, this stream is affected by metal pollution due to mine effluent and runoffs. So we perform a mesocause experiment in 5 sites along the stream, following a chemical balance. Briefly, upstream 1 was located before the well, so it was neither affected by hydrological alteration nor metal pollution. Upstream 2 was affected by hydrological alteration and metal pollution. The mine site was the most contaminated site because it was situated just down the mine effluent. The upstream 1 was also affected by hydrological alteration and metal pollution. And finally, downstream 2 received the water diverted from the channel, and it was expected to have lower metal pollution levels than downstream 1. We use mesocause experiments because these kind of experimental approaches are very useful to detect and quantify the ecological role of species, but also to disentangle cause-effect relationships between stressors and biological responses. So mesocause experiments can increase our mechanistic understanding of anthropogenic stressor effects. For the Girona stream, we use 4 side cages made of plastic mesh and supported by steel bars. For this experiment, we use 3 different types of treatments, differing in fish density. A treatment simulating the lack of fish, a treatment simulating the actual fish density in the stream, and a treatment simulating high fish density, in which we place 6 fish inside. For the source stream, we use cages made of high-density polyethylene and supported by wooden square structure. The design of these cages allows us to avoid the interference of metals that we would otherwise have with the steel bars, but also we create cages more robust to resist the higher water flows of the source stream. For this experiment, we used to target treatments. A treatment simulating the lack of fish, and a treatment simulating high fish density. In both experiments, at the beginning of the experiments, we filled cages with colonized stream cohorts to simulate the natural conditions inside. And we used, as a species model, the various dynamics. Treatments were replicated 3 times at each site, and the duration of the experiment was 2 weeks. During the 2 experiments, we determined the discharge, some physicochemical parameters, phosphate and ammonia concentrations in water, and dissolved metal concentrations in water. Regarding periphyton, we determined the biomass, including chlorophyll concentration and aspirate mass, metal concentrations accumulated, and the nutrient content, including carbon, nitrogen, and carbon phosphorus ratios, and also it was performed an experiment focused on nutrient active rates by periphyton using the nutrient addition technique. We also estimate the density of macroinvertebrates and that of the functional feeding groups. Families of Ephemeroctera, Lectura were grouped as EPT taxa, whereas families of Odonata, Coleoptera, and Hemiptera were grouped as OCH taxa. We also estimated dry biomass of macroinvertebrates and the metal concentrations accumulated in their tissues. So the third chapter was entitled Combined Effects of Hydrological Alteration and Cyprian Fish Mediated by Geochemical Processes in a Mediterranean Stream. This work was published in Science of the Total Environment. The main objective of this study was to compare the structural and functional response of 2 stream breaches differing in terms of hydrological alteration to additional alterations associated with the loss or increased density of fish. We performed Fermanova analysis to test for the effects of reach and treatment on the structural responses of both periphyton and macroinvertebrates. So here you can see that there were clear differences between the permanent and regulated reach, but in contrast, treatment effects were not significant for any of the response variables. These bar plots show the density and biomasses of macroinvertebrates in the permanent reach, regulated reach, and also in our treatments. So we found higher densities of macroinvertebrates and biomasses in the regulated reach. Chironomidae was the most abundant macroinvertebrate family, and also we found that racers account for a significant fraction of biomass in the regulated reach. As I mentioned before, treatment effects were not significant, indicating that the top-down control of fishes on macroinvertebrates was weak. Is it possible that a great variation in flow and also the eutrophication conditions can attenuate the top-down control of fishes on lower eutrophic as previous studies suggest? Moreover, we found that the periphyton biomass, including the chlorophyll concentration and aspirate mass, was found to be lower in the regulated reach. This finding was related to a higher concentration in this reach. In support of this finding, our variation partitioning results show that macroinvertebrates account for 30% of the total variation, whereas the shared effects of macroinvertebrates and reach account for 41% of the variation. As a result of this higher grazing ratio, we also found that periphyton from the regulated reach was more nitrogen rich, since carbon and nitrogen ratio was lower in the regulated reach. Again, the variation conditioning results show that macroinvertebrates account for 44% of the variation, and the same variation explained by the shared effects of macroinvertebrates and reach. Treatment effects were significant. The risk treatment interaction was found to be significant for the phosphate active periphyton. This means that, as you can see, that treatments lacking fish, periphyton show higher phosphate active rates compared to the other treatments and the other and the permanent reach. In this case, we found that fish density explained 80% of the variation. Moreover, it's worth mentioning that we found that the periphyton from the regulated reach show higher capacity to nutrient to ammonium removal per unit of food. To sum up, in the regulated range, the absence of fish leads to indirect positive effects on nutrient removal, likely through racial peripheral interactions. In contrast, in the permanent breeds, the absence of fish did not result in changes in the functional responses of the pattern. It would suggest that the more stable communities from the permanent breeds that were not affected by hydrological alteration could compensate for the absence of fish. So we conclude that the Barbus meridionalis can mediate the effects of hydrological alteration. The last chapter was entitled Indirect Food-Web Interactions Are Mediated by Metal Pollution in an Ecosystem Engineer, Barbus meridionalis cyclina in a Mediterranean stream. This work was submitted for publication in Aquatic Sciences. The main objective of this study was to evaluate the responses of periphyton biomass and abundance of benthic macrovertebrates to the presence and absence of a predatory fish, Barbus meridionalis, along the metal pollution gradient. Here you can see that water discharge was low in upstream too, and also the average values of zinc concentration in the main site largely exceed the chronic toxicity threshold of 120 micrograms per liter established for freshwater biota. So it is likely that the differences observed along the metal polluted stream is related to the zinc toxicity. This scattered plot shows the trace metal concentrations accumulated in periphyton and former macrovertebrate families. So we found that periphyton had the largest metal loads, and also, as reflected by the positive relationship, both type of organisms show similar patterns of bioaccumulation. Moreover, we found differences in bioaccumulation between the four macrovertebrate families, with convidem, which are predatory invertebrates, showing the lowest numbers of metal concentrations of zinc, lead, and cadmium. In agreement with this, previous studies found that carnivores tend to accumulate lower metal concentrations, whereas herbivores or racers tend to accumulate higher metal concentrations because they are more exposed to the metal pollution of the periphyton. The higher metal concentrations accumulated in the periphyton. However, in our stream, the family Limnidae, which are racing snails, were extirpated from the most polluted sites, indicating that this taxon is very sensitive to metal pollution. The biomonitoring study revealed that while periphyton biomass did not decrease due to metal exposure, total density of macrovertebrates and biomass were lower in the mine and downstream water sites. At the upper level, we found that the Cameroptera and Coleoptera densities decreased also in mine and downstream water. And the percentage of the fraction of grazers also decreased in these two sites, which were the most polluted ones. Whereas the other functional feeding groups show similar densities. Regarding the mesopause experiments, we found that in general there was a decrease in macrovertebrate density during the fish stream, which is represented by green dotted columns. However, human effects were limited. In agreement with these results, a previous study of Rodriguez Lozano using the Mediterranean Barrier mesopause showed that treatments with high fish density tend to decrease the density of both primary and secondary mesomers. But also they found that these fish species have preference for eating chironomic larvae. Regarding the periphyton, we interestingly found that both chlorophyll concentration and asphyllite weight decreased during the fish treatment, regardless of metal pollution levels. This suggests that the benthic behavior of this fish can cause bioaccumulation, thus decreasing the biomass of the periphyton. It's also worth mentioning that chlorophyll concentration of upstream 1 was lower compared to the other sites. It is likely that racers from this site were capable of controlling these variables. To sum up, in polluted reaches, the absence of fish revealed that the direct negative effects of zinc on macrovertebrates lead to indirect positive effects on verified environments. In contrast, in non-polluted reaches, the absence of fish results in cascading responses. So, we conclude that metal pollution altered the outcomes of the species interactions in the absence of fish. In contrast, we found that the presence of fish led to decrease both the density of macrovertebrates and the verified environments. So we conclude that the top-down control by barrier meridionalis was not context dependent, and fish modified metal pollution effects. Let's move on to the general discussion. We know that Mediterranean climate rivers have strong variations in flow, and aquatic organisms have to deal with increments of water velocity. In this thesis, we evaluate the effects of flow velocity on the physiological responses of fish, and our results indicate that there exists both intra- and interspecific variation. These extreme ecosystems are commonly affected by anthropogenic stressors that have negative effects on aquatic organisms. These organisms are interlinked by biotic interactions in ecological networks. So this means that anthropogenic stressors can be transmitted across trophic levels. Our results from the Mesopost experiments show that there exist food web-related stressor effects induced by the presence or absence of fish in streams impacted by hydrological alteration and metal pollution. Regarding the results of the aquatic respirometry, we found that some invasive species like leek have higher critical swimming speed than some native species. Also, a previous study of Canada, Brazil, accounting for all the existing information regarding marine species, demonstrate that invasive species actually have a similar capacity of swimming as native species after controlling water. So, the results are contrary to the notion that native species can cope better with high flows because of a higher swimming performance. Previous studies also suggest that a combination of behavioral, morphological, and physiological adaptations may explain why invasive species are less tolerant to high flows. Physiological limitations can be, or adaptations can be, a higher scope. In agreement with this, we found that some native species tend to have higher absolute aerobic scope than some invasive species of similar size. So we conclude that future studies should account for physiological responses of species to better understand patterns of fish assemblage structure in streams. Regarding the field experiments, our results show that local environmental conditions can shape extreme community responses. So now I'm going to show what is happening under conditions of water diversion and metal pollution. Water diversion reduces the density of species, and the shared effects of water diversion and stream flow increase the density of colonist species. As a result, periphyton biomass was controlled by macrovertebrates. And also we found that periphyton was more nitrogen rich and showed positive nutrient upgrades. In contrast, in situations of metal pollution, we found that toxicity reduced both the densities and biomasses of fishes and macrovertebrates, and that periphyton biomass benefit from a lower grazing pressure. However, periphyton tend to accumulate the largest metal loads. Moreover, in situations with reduced light by high nutrient saturation, it seems that periphyton become less efficient at taking in nutrients, as the study of Rubio demonstrated. We also found that the long-term effects of fishes are often context-dependent, while in many or low-impacted environments are streams affected by metal pollution, fish predation and biodiversity are detectable. In a stream with hydrological alteration, this top-down control becomes weaker. It seems that flow-related disturbances can increase the production rates of beds, thus decreasing the importance of precipitation. In this case, the production rates of hydrogen. Moreover, the lack of biota in these streams could be related to differences in substrate type and the shifts in species organisms colonizing these stream colonies. Before I finish this presentation, I would like to raise some potential management and future directions based on our results. Increasing knowledge of consuming capabilities can increase our can help us to categorize the fish habitat preferences and improve the management of invasive species. Moreover, identifying the drivers of variation in swimming speed can be useful to improve barrier stability and for the design of these passes. In addition, research on the effects of flow regulation on streams can increase our capacity to forecast future scenarios of water scarcity. Effects-based methods for monitoring water quality can increase the prediction of cause-effect relationships, especially in toxicity assessments. And finally, identifying ecosystem engineers must be a priority to protect these species, but also to improve the management of water bodies. So the committee considers appropriate and will read the conclusions. Conclusions of the chapter 1. Differences in swimming performance and energetic cost between an endangered rabbit tooth carp, Aphaniocereus, and an invasive mosquito fish and Rubio-Gracia. Both sexes of Aphaniocereus show similar swimming performance and metabolic rates, whereas males in Rubio-Gracia perform better than females. Aphaniocereus show lower critical swimming speed and higher maximum metabolic rate and subaerobic scope than Rubio-Gracia after controlling for body size. Rubio-Gracia show lower minimum cost of transport and higher optimal swimming speed than Aphaniocereus for a given body mass. Rubio-Gracia also show lower mass-specific cost of transport at a comparable body mass. Our problem of factor and finite ratio significantly drive the differences in swimming performance and efficiency between the two species. The more hydrodynamic and streamlined body shape of Rubio-Gracia results in greater capacity to withstand the water flow and to reduce swimming costs. It seems that the native species may be at a competitive disadvantage over the invasive mosquito fish whenever they coexist, especially for those ecological processes in which swimming is necessary, such as food capture and predator avoidance. Conclusions of the chapter 2. Size-related effects and the influence of metabolic rates and morphology on swimming performance in fish. Body mass was largely the best predictor of swimming speed and metabolic rates within a species. After accounting for body mass, critical swimming speed was independently affected by development or maximum metabolic rate in certain fish species, indicating that the sign of the relationship between swimming capacity and other traits may not always be positive within a species. The standard metabolic rate and relative critical swimming speed were positively related to maximum metabolic rate. Maximum metabolic rate and relative critical swimming speed were also positively related to mass and companion ratios. Among the studied species, Alburnus performed best in terms of swimming performance and efficiency. However, the Lepomys gibosus attained lower mass-specific cost of transport than some stream species, possibly reflecting a poor prediction strategy to compensate for hydrodynamic disadvantages. This study provides insight into the key factor influencing the swimming performance of fish at both intra and post-specific levels. Conclusions of the chapter 3. Combined effects of hydrological alteration of the breeding fish in mediated by geochemical processes in a Mediterranean stream. In a stream, local environmental conditions were critical for microhabitat intelligence. The high abundance of chironomic larvae was attributed to the high resilience capacity of this taxon to cope with fluctuating changes in hydrological regime. The variation in peripheral chlorophyll concentration and total biomass was inversely associated with the variation in micrometeorite density along the stream, thus reflecting a strong top-down control of cases on primary producers. Fish density treatment did not cause structural changes in stream bedding communities. Nonetheless, fish exclusion led to enhanced peripheral phosphate uptake in the regulated reach, likely due to the effects of grazing. The lack of variation in nutrient removal by periphyton communities from the permanent reefs suggests that the hydrological alterations can hamper the ability of stream biotic communities to compensate for the absence of fish. It can be concluded that the density of fish values can mediate the effects of anthropogenic alterations on benthic communities and associated biogeochemical processes in flow-regulated science. Conclusions of the chapter 4. Indirect food-water interactions mediated by metal pollution and an ecosystem engineered values in a Mediterranean stream. In the most metal polluted reaches of a such stream, zinc concentrations in water largely exceed the chronic toxicity threshold, 120 micrograms of zinc per liter, for freshwater biota, so that zinc was the primary pollutant driving the differences in toxicity observed among stream reaches. Verified and significantly show higher metal concentrations, mainly zinc, manganese, and iron, than macroinvertebrates, and metals did not biomagnify. Regarding macroinvertebrate functional filling groups, densities of racers significantly decreased in the most polluted reaches, indicating that they were highly sensitive to water pollution. This exclusion resulted in trophic cascade responses in the outward reference reach, resulting in lower proliferating chlorophyll concentration due to higher increasing pressure. Conversely, in the metal polluted reaches, this exclusion revealed indirect positive effects of metal pollution on periphyral biomass by lowering increasing pressure. Irrespective of metal pollution levels along the stream, the density of difference significantly decreased within the stream, indicating a strong predation effects on this taxon. To a lesser extent, variation in the density of repeated taxon and the total macroinvertebrate density approaches statistical significance. Interestingly, both periphyral chlorophyll concentration and total biomass significantly decreased in fish streamers as a result of the bioturbation caused by the benthic fish behavior. Because the presence of fish modified the direct effects of metals on ecosystem structure, that is, an increased periphyral biomass that would otherwise occur in the absence, it can be concluded that changes in fish density values unidentities can modify the effects of chemical pollution in the streams. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Seth, for the presentation. And now it's start the part of the discussion with the jury. And the first member that asked questions today is
First of all, I would like to first of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me your presentation of your PhD, and congratulate you and your directors for the PhD. I know it's a hard work, long hard work, and we are here. Let's try to enjoy discussion about science and try to relax, because probably I'm more nervous than you, because this is my first time as a UE, so let's try to enjoy. Okay. Well, first of all, I will start just to point out some these silly errors I see on the document. Like, for example, I realize you were not constant with the use of the symbols of the international units, like Lectura. You use the uppercase and the lowercase, the capital letter. Okay. Better now? Probably this is because you have published some of the articles in different journals, and then when you put all the articles together, you have to change the format for making a whole or making a sense, but they came from different journals with different formats, and well, it's not easy. But you have to try to be consistent with this kind of things. On the other hand, for example, I saw some errors like separating the units from the numbers at the end of a line or something like that. I have a lot of these kind of silly things along the document. I can send you in order to improve at least the final article. But this is not really important. From my point of view, the important things are related with the topics you try to deal with. In your document, at the beginning you have some common methods, and you talk about the steady, unsteady, and partial. But you classify them in three categories. But as far as I know, you discuss only about two: the parts and steady and velocity. I miss the reference of Howard 2016 that properly described this swimming performance, and he said that, for example, sustained swimming is typically more than 200 minutes. The prolonged is more between 220 minutes.
Yeah, depending on the duration.
Yeah. And the burst is less than 20 seconds. And I would like to know which is your opinion and why you don't use this reference and which work, because you talk about this type of swimming performance, but I missed the description of this swimming performance in terms of times or the times or swimming velocity.
Yes, for the aquatic respiratory experiments, I use the critical swimming speed, which is a measure of ground swimming performance. But in the general introduction, I wanted to provide a full picture of the swimming performance in fish, not only focusing on providing the swimming performance, but also saying that there are two types of swimming that fishes can employ. So in the general introduction, I say that there are three categories of swimming: sustained, prolonged, and poor swimming. And yeah, as I say, the sustained and prolonged entails steady swimming, which is basically the critical swimming speed, and the poor swimming entails unsteady movements. But I didn't focus on this type of movements in the swimming fields, just critical swimming speed.
And do you have any opinion about these categories? Because they came from the engineers that work with dams and fish space. But recently I have seen an article that I've already accepted, and it's in a collaboration with the people from the University of Valencia, and they have cleared these categories. But for me, as a biologist, I don't feel comfortable about these closed categories. What is your opinion about this?
I don't know. Yes, because I haven't read this article. Well, I don't know my opinion.
Because it's a very, well, we as a biologist used to work with the numbers, not with the categories. From my point of view, using these categories, we first lost a lot of information because we lost the numbers, and is trying to classify the swimming performance in three types, losing the context and the variability.
Yeah, maybe the fish swimming is more complex, than only trying to classify in three categories. And well, I don't want to be wrong, but I think that fishes can commonly employ to different types of swimming. For instance, during the determination of critical swimming speed, when fishes are reaching the fatigue, they usually tend to change from steady to unsteady swimming. And in that moment is when you stop the experiment. No? So fishes can use two types of swimming in the nature, no? For instance. So it's
okay. Now I'm going to talk with you about some statistics issues, which are not only in one chapter, but in some of them. For example, in chapter 4, you use Kruskal-Wallis to compare between the, okay? From my point of view, Kruskal-Wallis is something like the ugly duck of the statistics to compare groups, because nobody use it. Because if you want to make an ANOVA comparing 3 or more groups, you have to use an ANOVA if your data are normal and homogeneous. If they are not normal but homogeneous, you use Kruskal-Wallis. And if they are not homogeneous neither normal, you use Wallis test. Kruskal-Wallis then you use it when your data are not normally distributed. But most of the people say, well, ANOVA is robust to the non-normality, so I avoid using Kruskal-Wallis. But you use it. Why? Because if your data are not normally distributed or heterogeneous, it's better to use the Wallis test.
okay. As far as I know, is that when the data is normally distributed, you have to use ANOVAs because it's a kind of statistical analysis that is more robust than Kruskal-Wallis. But when your data is not normally distributed, you have two options: trying to transform this data into normal, or trying to figure out which kind of statistics can you use using not normally distributed data. And that's why I use the Kruskal-Wallis.
And when they are not homogeneous, don't you prefer using another test?
Yes, because if I would have used an analysis of the variance, I had to transform this data.
So you prefer to transform the data?
No, I didn't. That's why I used the Kruskal-Wallis.
Okay. Well,
I don't know if I answered your question.
yes, more.
I'm not really sure about the statistics.
When you are measuring the metabolic rate, okay, you measure the MMR, okay? But how you measure, because I'm not sure if I understand properly the document, how you measure the standard metabolic rate? As an interpolation of?
No. The maximum metabolic rate was defined as the highest metabolic rate recorded during the swimming period. So if the typical swimming speed is stepwise increases of flow velocity, the maximum metabolic rate usually occurs at the last velocity, where fishes are usually reaching the fatigue. So the last value of oxygen consumption rate was, in most of the cases, the maximum metabolic rate.
But the standard metabolic rate?
The standard metabolic rate, as I use swim tunnel respirometers, manual, not automatic, I had to extrapolate the standard metabolic rate by using the exponential function. So if I would use for instance, static chambers, and I've left the fish overnight in order that they get totally relaxed, then I can measure daily the standard metabolic rate. But with this kind of experimental approaches, the solution is that is extrapolating the standard metabolic rate by using the exponential function. The parameter A is the standard metabolic rate extrapolated to the expression.
So I understand properly. Okay, because when I made my PhD, I measured the standard metabolic rate with these chambers in darkness during hours. So you measure the passive metabolism of the.
It's always better using this kind of experimental approaches because you are directly measuring the SMR. And this is what I'm doing now with one experiment that I'm doing, like with static chambers, with no flow, and where I put the fish there, and I leave them to rest for work. And I measure oxygen consumption rates overnight, and then I put them in of the. But in this case, using spirometers, you can use the critical zone split protocol to extrapolate the SMR. So it's an indirect measure.
Yeah. So if you indirectly are measuring the standard metabolic rate, is something that is expected that maximum metabolic rate and standard metabolic rate are must be related. Isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. So in doing your PhD, you said the standard metabolic rate and maximum metabolic rate are related, of course, because they are calculated from the same data.
Yeah, but after controlling for body mass.
Okay.
So, yes, previous studies also demonstrated there exists a positive relationship, showing that species with higher standard metabolic rate also have higher metabolic rate. So it's an associated cause, no? These species have more aerobic performance, but after controlling for body mass.
Okay. But probably you know some of my previous work. I suppose that the expected question is why you don't use geometric morphometric instead of using finite ratio, Cauda Pelopon factor, propulsive ratio. You can use geometric morphometric techniques and avoid using these approximations that are, if they are, size dependent.
Mm-hmm. I can tell you the reason. In that moment, it was the thing that I thought that was more convenient, but it's true that using other techniques are more effective. In that moment, it's the thing that.
Because by using these approximations, which are size dependent, of course, you will find a lot of relationships between these parameters and metabolic rate and swimming, because size is behind them.
Mm-hmm.
So the most appropriate technique to avoid this side effects is scaling the section and so on, and you can do it only by using geometric morphometrics that avoid the size, and you only compare sex by using lambda. In my opinion, these techniques will be better in order to analyze these patterns without the effect of size, which is behind all of these processes. In concrete, I would like to ask you about the propulsive ratio. From my experience, these parameters is hard to measure because you have to measure the surface of the things,
Yes.
and sometimes you have to move them. You have to
It was sometimes tricky.
yeah.
And the thing that is hard to measure.
Yeah, the question is, you trust on these parameters.
You
You trust you think that the values you obtain are good enough, or sometimes are what?
I agree with you that there are, that for instance, geometric is more robust, and also that mathematic ratios are slightly different. I totally agree with you.
But in concrete with the propulsive ratio, measuring the thing, you have to properly.
Yes, well, I use the zoom option to focus on a specific body trait and then draw the line, and following the shape of the fish.
Okay. From my point of view, it's one of the parameters I say, well, this is so hard to measure that I think it's not very reliable. It's like it's hard to believe that the numbers you get are good enough, in my opinion. But I never measure this parameter.
Yeah. I follow some important contributions using these kind of mathematical ratios. I inspired in this a couple of works. But yes, I agree with you. I take you.
Okay. In chapter 2, you select heritage species. Why these heritage species?
Yes, the original idea was more enthusiastic. We wanted to include many species, okay, but there was a moment that we said, okay, stop, because you have a lot of, maybe you have a lot of data, and also we account for different species with different body sizes and morphological traits. So for the purpose of the study, it was comparing this wide spectrum of sizes, and it was enough.
Okay.
So that was.
How do you feel about the sample size? Because, for example, you have only 6
Only 6?
Or probably it was a mistake, but they are unbalanced, and in some cases they are really low.
Because it's very time consuming, because as I said, this type of equipment are not automatic. So each day in one fish. And sometimes the experiments didn't go well, so I had to repeat. That's why sometimes one species has 15, the other has 10 or 12. Of course, as higher is the sample, higher is the more accurate are the results.
Yeah, but the main problem is that even not only the sample size, but the unbalance. In some species you have a lot of individuals, but in another ones you have only one or some samples.
It was also hard to find these individuals under the same conditions in the streams, no? Because the densities fluctuate, and sometimes you go to the field and you didn't find any individual. No?
Okay. During the lecture of the chapter 3, I was thinking which kind of weight we are talking about. It's a big dam, or it's only just a small wall or something like that, since I saw the picture. So in the picture I understand some things that you said previously, like for example the rivers tend to dry because of the waves. In my experience, well, the presence of dams, waves, and so on, I tend not to dry the rivers, but to yes, to regulate it. Yes. Okay, but when I saw the picture, I understand what you're talking about, because they use this word to start.
There is a direction channel for irrigation. So they are taking water from the stream.
But in fact, it's really a small one. It's a really small one.
But they are scaled to the small rivers that are running from where I carry on my experiments.
The thing is, how far you think this kind of ways can regulate the rivers? Of course, they are used to the water for irrigation, but the big flow cannot be stopped for this kind of waste.
Yeah.
So the effects on flow regulation of this kind of waste is not so hard.
I think that the problem occurs in summer, when 1 year we have a normal summer and the other we have strong summer drought. And if the water is reducing the discharge, we are at risk of having no low flows in downstream. And this is the case of the Girona Stream, in which some years downstream from the well became isolated with isolated pores. So it's clear that there is an effect of hydrological alteration here. So,
Okay. In the chapter 4, you select only 4 representative macroinvertebrates. Why? Why only 4 and why these 4?
Well, before the experiment, I carried out some samplings of macroinvertebrates, and these 4 were quite abundant, some on the stream. And also, I tried to find families of macroinvertebrates representing different functional activities.
Okay.
But yes, then I realized that there were not racers being racing snails in the mine site. But yeah, that was the thing.
In fact, I'm not expert in macroinvertebrates, and I have to take my gadget guide to see which functional groups were these macroinvertebrates.
Yeah, also
I guess probably it's because of the function of the.
Yeah, exactly. And also, for instance, hydroxylides are commonly used for analysis of metal combinations. So this, I choose this taxon for the reason, because then I can compare the other ones. Convidem, there are insects, snails are racers, and Lectura were very abundant in Lectura. This taxon of Lectura was very abundant.
Okay, in this chapter, when do you think snails disappear?
Because they are very sensitive to metal pollution.
That's what
Well, I can demonstrate this, but our results suggest that. And it makes sense, as we found that they can accumulate a lot of metal concentrations. So if this snail quite fit directly on verified environments, on contaminated verified environments, it is likely that this can affect the snails.
My first thought was probably because of the pH, because probably we have very active waters, and probably this affects the carbonate of the sand.
This stream is not acid.
But I was looking for the pH, and I saw that it was not so low. So I was thinking, what is the cause? What could be?
Yeah, and also, I also think that it's related to metal contamination, because we found this taxon in upstream too, which is very close to the mine site. So why we find the snails in upstream too, which is located maybe 50 meters away, from the main site, and in this site we don't find anything.
I'm totally agree with some of the results related to sex, size, and velocity barriers, and so on. As I told you, the results fit with the article that I have sent, that I present in the, probably you know it because you congratulate me because of the presentation at the civic meeting. But these results, your results, fit perfectly with my results. So probably we are not so wrong. Okay, we have the correct way. But knowing this, how do you improve the velocity barriers? These barriers in the rivers. Because during your presentation, you said that we can use these results to manage, to implement these results in the.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, how do you do it?
I think that it's important to take into account the body size, morphological traits of the species, and also behavioral traits. So one species might be a very good swimmer, but maybe it has a pelagic behavior. So maybe this species cannot go forward, but maybe one species that is benthic can go upstream. But this depends strongly on the design of the fish passes. So yeah, I think that the key determinants of fish passes are body size, swimming capabilities, morphological traits, and other aspects such as behavior.
I suppose to design a fish pass, keeping in mind the morphology of all the species, behavior.
Yes, well, actually, this is very challenging, no? And this is what the experts in this field are experiencing, that it's very difficult to adapt one design to cover all the species. No? And so far, most of the fish passes have been focused on one species, but then we realize that the other species is not.
In most of cases, are monoids.
Yeah.
In keeping this in mind, what do you think about that removal? You know, it's something that fortunately our administration is starting to do, and they are removing most of the wells and dams that are not useful or almost destroyed or whatever. And what's your opinion about this? And what is your opinion about dam removal in the context of the alien species that we have on the river? Because some experts say that we cannot remove all the dams because we can help, we can promote the alien species to disperse upstream, but I would like to know your opinion.
It's really to answer. I think that so removing the dams, I think it's positive, or maybe it can be positive in the long term. Okay. So research has demonstrated that invasive species benefit from low flows. So if we have a physical barrier in streams, this reduces discharge, and maybe that's why invasive species spread. No. Sorry,
No, that's all. But
yes, and also in terms of in ecosystemic, the other part, hydrological alterations can also influence ecosystem structure and function. So I think it's a good idea if we remove physical barriers from streams.
Yeah, in my opinion, even more. If we have the rivers in good conditions, structurally and functionally in good conditions, we are making our rivers more resistant and resilient to the arrival of these alien species. So not only we can reduce the presence of these species, but also we are making that harder to establish in our rivers. So, in my opinion, removing all those useful barriers is essential. And finally, well, not finally, but what is your opinion about using fish like a peer indicator? Because I don't know if you know that the Water Framework Directive use or ask for use some groups of taxonomic groups to rate, to evaluate the status of our rivers. But fishes, in the Royal Decree of 2015, if I don't remember, if I remember properly, they were not included because we have problems to use them as an indicator. Which is your opinion about this?
Well, I think that they are good indicators, but I can tell you exactly why. We know that fish populations are declining, because climate change and anthropogenic stressors. Also, we know that some traits, like physiological traits or swimming performance, can be related to fitness. Also, many ecotoxicological studies use fishes, for risk assessments. So, yes, I think that they are good indicators of.
But if you go to the river, take the fishing, and take the species that you find, it's hard to use this information as evaluation because, for example, the river from the Cantabrian, you have only 2 or 3 species, and probably they are in good condition. But here in the Mediterranean River, you probably have 5, 6, 10 species, and in most of cases, they are in worse status than the Cantabrian rivers. So using only the species seems not a good approximation or good enough to evaluate the status of the. But using traits like morphology and so on, in my opinion, it's hard to apply this in the context of the application of DF.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
So, from my point of view, they are good indicators, but I have no idea about how properly use them.
Me neither. Yeah, me neither. Well, because my thesis has not been focused on indicators, so I can answer you properly because I don't have the information assimilated. I don't know.
Okay. Finally, in order to link with Sophie, probably the main problem of this thesis is that we have clear 2 blocks. And sometimes it's hard to, I say sometimes because when I start to read your thesis, I say, they have nothing in common. But at the end, I probably say, well, they have something in common. Could you explain us this, how you see, in order to make them like a unique,
It was even hard for me to figure out how can I link the both parts because it's obvious that they are very different. But I think that this can be a weakness, but also a strength. Because I think that for the management of water bodies, we need to have an holistic approach or knowledge of the things that are happening in the river. So, yes.
Probably now everything is easier when it's finished. Then later you say, I'm from the outside, everything is more clear. Probably I miss that you use some of the techniques you have used in the species level at the community level. For example, this morphological approximation of this measuring the metabolites, not only at the species level, but also at the community level, trying to link both blocks that clearly appears in your case. But as I say, this is easy when you are outside, when you have not to take into account all the time consuming and those things.
Yeah, maybe one experiment, stereometry experiment, including some environmental factor, is having to better link of this is what I have.
In any case, congratulations with your thesis.
Thank you, Professor. Now it's the time of your it works.
Well, first I also want to say thank you for inviting me, and I also want to extend my congratulations to a very nice thesis. It was a pleasure to read. It was a pleasure to read it. I think it was well thought through. It was nice. I also want to take the opportunity to congratulate you for your presentation today, which I thought was really nice, not just from a scientific level, but also on a communication level. So bravo for that. Now I have plenty of questions, both high and low, and you could be here all night, so I'm not going to go through all of it necessarily. So I will focus mainly on chapter 4, because as you may know, that's my background in geochemistry and mining and contaminants. Briefly touch the other chapters a little bit. But first, continuing on the communication aspect of your presentation, etc. You can take a moment before answering, because I know it's not always easy, but it's also a follow-up on the last question here with the line in between all the chapters. And so if you were to describe your work, I mean, it's a few years now, but if you need to boil it down into one single sentence, what would that be?
Sorry, that?
You need to describe your work
In one sentence.
one sentence. What have you done?
Well, I would say that variations in flow and metal pollution have negative effects on aquatic organisms.
So I think that's an excellent answer to it. And it also helps if you keep that in mind. And I think if you had kept that in mind as you were writing the thesis, it also eases the process of linking the chapters together. So like just boil it down into this one single message that you can then use as a red thread through the rest of it. And it's not, to me, it was not a serious issue, but I agree that there was 2 blocks in it. And the general discussion at the end did sort of bring it together, though. Okay, so just like I mentioned, for the first chapter, so we only have like small detailed questions. So in chapter 1, you mentioned that in order to obtain up to 20 individuals of each sex from the different fishes when you're collecting them. But then you also state that in total, 13 females and 15 males were used, and then later on 30 females and 30 males. So if you were fishing for 20, how come you ended up with 30?
How many fish shall you collect? So
you say yourself, I mean, it's just, I think it might be just an error in the writing.
yeah.
But it says that you obtained up to 20 individuals of each sex.
Yes.
But then later on, you had 30 females and 30 males. So then you fished more than 20, right?
It must be a mistake.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to sort of verify that. The words matter. And then the second one, also in the discussion, you mentioned that These differences in swimming performance and efficiency can partly be explained by the habitat preference and morphological features. Now, wouldn't it sort of be the other way around? That the swimming performance dictates their habitat preference more so than the habitat preference would dictate their swimming performance?
I think that there is a close relationship between fish swimming and habitat use, because fishes tend to maximize their swimming capacity for different ecological processes. So the thing that I say in the manuscript is that our results indicate that the Ambusa rocky, because have more hydrodynamic shape and higher swimming capabilities, can be found in downstream reaches. Whereas the Aphanius or the poor swimming performance of Aphanius would indicate that maybe this species, which have more deeper caudal color, can tend to maximize the other type of swimming that I didn't test, but this is just a hypothesis. And this type of swimming, which is the steady movements, like rapid runs or the lifts, can be useful, or maneuverability, sorry, can be useful in ponds or lagoons where aquatic environments are very complex. No? So there might be some trade-off between the two types of swimming, and between the two species.
Yeah. Then we'll quickly skip to chapter 2 because I want to save more time for chapter 4. So if I understood it correctly, in chapter 2, you compared both, there's different species that were collected from different rivers, but also from different years, correct? Like from 2014 to 2017. Do you think that this would have an impact on your overall results? The fact that you're comparing not just different species, but also from different springs, and then also different habitats over time, sort of?
I have to be honest, and this can influence. However, I think that the main aim of the paper was to compare different species, different body size and morphological traits. So I think that the effects associated with these contrasting traits can overwhelm the low variation in discharge, for instance, between springs. We also try to go sampling in the same months, trying to also the same locations in the rivers.
And do you know, in terms of the rivers, were there any difference in sort of you see a difference, how much would that, the specific places where you collected them, was there a big difference between the different years if you came back, or was it kind of the similar flow, the similar?
It was similar.
Okay.
But I didn't measure discharge, so, but visually it was similar.
Okay. And I mean, I agree exactly what you said, that it's perhaps a weakness a little bit, but unfortunately in science we often have to do the best with what we can, and we can't always go to all places.
I think that the Rubio-Gracia also mentioned this, and I focus one part of the discussion to describe these methodological limitations.
Then in the discussion, because you used a quite short acclimation period of 1 hour for chapter 2, the next version. And you said that this could likely be related to the short acclimation period of 1 hour, and then later on you continue. In general, several hours are needed to obtain the best accuracy. And you also state preferences, etc. So I guess my question is that if you knew this from the literature beforehand, why did you still choose just 1 hour?
Because I already started experiment using 1 hour, and I wanted to compare all the species under similar experimental conditions.
Did you expect, if you would have done it differently now or gone back, do you think you would have a different results, or would it have been more or less the same?
There are some studies that demonstrate that acclimation period do not affect the swimming performance, but it can affect the standard metabolic rate. So it is likely that this short period of approximation affect my method. But as I said, I use this similar experimental conditions, so maybe this effect of the short period of approximation affect all the species in the same way.
And so if you were to go back and do it again, would you have changed it, or would you still stand by the 1 hour?
Yes, I would increase the time.
Then for chapter 3, it's quite a general question actually. Because if I understood it correctly, that study was performed in the spring, right? It was just performed in the spring. It was in the spring season.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think you would you have seen a different outcome if you would have performed it in the fall? And so what kind of difference would you expect to see?
Yes, I think that seasonality of the flow regimes can influence the outcomes of the experiments. I think that most of the existing information in that time, in 2015, all the experiments were carried out under isolated pools or in summer, but not with high flows. And I think that this study was one of the first ones testing this, testing the total control fishes, under high flows. But of course, if I would have tested in another season, I expect to find different results.
And then also just, it's more to verify for me, more or less. Because you also mentioned that both reaches were recovering from a recent flood, and that one reach is permanent, least impacted reach, etc. But wouldn't that, if it's been exposed to flood, wouldn't that have impacted something, or do you think that it still was the same impact of the flood on both reaches? So it's still.
I think it's the same. So the explanation of why we found significant differences in the related reach but not in the permanent reach, it's mainly associated with the hydrological alterations. So it's clear that the stream communities in the regulated reach are experiencing a great deal of flow alterations, and also nutrient loads. So it's a very high impacted stream. And the permanent reach, or communities from the permanent reach, I think that can act or serve as a buffer, so there can be a movement from upstream to downstream. So it's important to keep the permanent reach as it is.
Yeah, and I guess also, I mean, if they both were flooded, maybe the impact would have equaled out in what we would have seen anyhow. Because the flooding was in a similar event, right?
I can confirm this, but I thought that yes.
Okay. Then I would like to move on to chapter 4. And just first, because it's stated, I just want to ask about the status, if there's been any change. It said in the thesis it was submitted. Is there any change in that now, or is it still in submission?
Yes, I'm in the process of review.
Okay, congratulations. That's a good start. Would you mind describing your role in that study design? Like if you were to write an author contribution paragraph for some manuscripts or some journals now, they ask about the author contribution, who wrote it, who designed the experiment, etc. Do you know what I'm getting at? Or
No.
Okay. So for most journals now, or more and more journals,
Yes.
they ask about the author contribution.
Yes.
And so could you just describe, because it's not part in this, so could you describe your role in this study or in this chapter?
Okay, yes. My role was working and helping in the field, also lab, identifying macroinvertebrates. I also had helped my colleague, which was also performing another study focusing on microbes, but we use the same setup. I help with verified biomass and nutrients. And also I wrote the manuscript.
Were you part of the design of it, or the initial design, or were you part of the discussion?
Well, at the beginning, all the collaborators, the people involved in this experiment, we met to plan how the setup, the experimental setup.
One of the reasons why I ask is because I'm curious, in part, but also because it's also to make sure that you know your value of the work that you've done as well. Because it's very easy to just remember that I was in the lab for hours, I was doing this, but at this point you have probably also an intellectual value that you contribute with, and maybe you're not aware of it yourself all the time. So that's why I'm also asking to trigger some thoughts from you, because you've done a lot and you should be proud of it, and you should also take credit for it. So I'm not trying to be mean or anything. Okay. So in the introduction, you mentioned that several field and theoretical studies have demonstrated contaminant-induced changes in either behavior, competition, or predation grazing rate that would alter the species abundances or community composition. Could you provide some examples of the behaviors that might change of that?
Yes. Well, I think that there are some studies that demonstrate that primary consumers can change their behavior. So, for instance, if they usually feed during the day, they change this pattern to the night in order to avoid the predator. So this can be one trait change, because of the predator and also because of the chemicals.
And were there any of, in your opinion, were such changes in behavior to be expected in your study beforehand? Did you expect to have seen such changes?
No, I think that my experiment was focused on observing density changes, or changes in biomes. But trait changes of a species are very difficult to observe in this kind of experimental process.
Okay. Okay, now it's more of a general question again, or a bigger one. And it's related to the objective, and it's also one of the things that is a bit reoccurring throughout all the chapters, I would say. And so you state that therefore we aim to evaluate the responses of purified biomass and abundance of benthic macroinvertebrates to the presences and absences of predatory fish along the mental pollution gradient. All that is fine. But so the question is, why is this important to know? Because very often, not specifically just this, but most of your objectives and also the conclusions, they're very scientific, which is good, because that's what we're here to talk about. But also, what's the greater purpose with it? Or why is it, if I'm being really harsh, why should anyone care about this?
Yes. Well, I think that how metal pollution can affect the total control of predators on lower trophic levels is a very current topic of interest from ecologists and ecologists. And previous studies focus only on the effects of predatory invertebrates on lower trophic levels of macroinvertebrates and very fine. But this is actually the first one showing data of the impact of fish on lower trophic levels in a garden of metal pollution.
Then, let's see, we're doing the time. How easy we can get. Could you walk me through so we're switching over to the material method section of chapter 4. Could you walk me through the sample preparation process for the metal analysis? Like how, in the lab, how did you do it? If you can just walk me through that process?
Yes, we prepare digested samples, so we add an acid that I can remember now, acid nitric, okay? Yes, we put the samples in a homogenator, and then these samples were moved to the coupled plasma. Well, this machine that I don't remember the name, but yeah, and this is the procedure.
Do you remember roughly how much material you used for this, for the nitric acid, etc., for the digestion?
Yeah, as for macrovertebrates, I use a big sample of macrovertebrates because I didn't know, well, I wanted to be sure that I obtained something, enough amount of individuals for the analysis of methods. So I mixed macrovertebrates in
You created a whole
yeah, exactly.
No, so it's more if you know the weight of it, what you actually mixed with the acid, roughly, yeah.
0.2, I think. I don't remember.
Grams or milligrams?
0.2 grams.
So the reason why I asked, it's in part because it's what I do on a daily basis, it's what I like to play with chemicals and stuff. But it's also because I was a little bit surprised about the amount of acid that was used, considering or depending then on the weight of it's on page 128. And I think it took part of the reason why you came up low in certain of your metal concentrations. It simply have been that you didn't have enough material in your initial, the ratio in between your material and the acid that you use. You basically diluted too much, so maybe it wasn't actually reaching the detection levels of the ICP-MS. And that's another question that I have, but we'll see how much I can push. You used an ICP-MS, correct? Or at least that's what you've written. Do you know which kind of ICP-MS it was?
Sorry, ICP?
ICP-MS, for the metal analysis?
Yeah, I think it's really
Well, yes and no. It's written the brand, but not the technique. Because within...
Yeah, for macrovertebrates were analyzed by inductively coupled plasma mass.
Yes. But that's just the general type of machine. And the reason I asked, for example, you can have it's an ICP-MS. You can then have a high resolution ICP-MS,
Yes.
or a quadruple ICP-MS, or a triple quadruple ICP-MS, or even a multi-collector ICP-MS. Okay.
No.
But the differences in between them, and it's also why I'm
I have to say that I have help with Maria, but also the technicians that work with this type of equipment. So.
Yeah. No, the reason why I ask again is also because these different types of techniques are often aimed at different level of concentrations.
Yeah.
So if you expect to have quite low concentrations, for example, in a water sample, then you need to choose one technique over the other. Or even though they're all called ICP-MS, that one would be able to pick up finer levels, the detection limit would actually go low.
Yes, I remember that we did like pilot experiments to figure out what concentration the organisms had. And also, depending on this, we use one type or the other.
Yeah.
And also, we follow previous study focus on fish. Yeah, so we follow the same methodology.
Okay. Let's see here. So you also, for the snails, you remove the shells, right?
Yes.
Why?
Because I remove the shells for the determination of biomasses.
Okay.
Yeah, well, this is what people do quantifying biomasses and also metal accumulation in the snails. I think that the shells of the snails can affect somehow the analysis.
Well, because I would actually argue that depends on which element you're looking for. But since lead, because there was Galena was one of the things that were mined for, right?
Yes.
Which would normally you would expect to see quite a bit of lead in the environment too, since lead is part of the Galena mineral. And lead can actually be found. Well, let me phrase it like this: do you know where would you expect lead to be found in a tissue of an organism? Would it be more in the protein matrix, or more in the bone, in tissues?
I don't know.
It's okay.
No, I don't know.
Because a lot of more recent studies are actually shown that lead can be more accumulated. It binds to the calcium material, to the calcite.
Yes.
It actually binds quite a lot to our bones, etc.
Okay.
And then for a snail, what would the shell would be made of, if you had to guess?
But I'm thinking that the other organisms that I compared didn't have shells. No? So
No.
maybe the most obvious reason to disregard no shells is, okay, let's compare all the species, the tissues of the species without considering.
True, but did the other species have shells or anything? So they didn't have any shells, which also meant that they could not store the lead in a shell, whereas the snail could. You see what I'm getting at?
Yes, but I don't know if because I don't know, but maybe the metal, the metal bioaccumulation in the shell do not affect the physiology of the snails, maybe because it's outside of the body.
Well, it is a storing spot for it, but it's also to sort of sum up this question or argument, is that you can have a difference between species, absolutely. You can have differences within the same species, but between individuals. But then you can also have a difference within the individual, depending on what you're measuring.
That's why I use a mixture of individuals to avoid the effects of size and other kind of factors that could have effect like this. So.
Yeah. No, and I mean it's not a serious fault, but I would have kept the snails too. Maybe remove them for the biomass calculation, but I would have done the metal analysis on this shell as well. But it's more on me. It's also because you can actually now, you can scan and detect, it's too technical, but don't worry, we can talk about it afterwards. Okay, so we already talked about lead in Galena, but do you remember which was the other thing that was mined for besides Galena at the mine?
Galena, lead. No.
Where's spellrite? I don't know how to pronounce it in English, actually.
Yes.
It's more the zinc component of it. Would you expect to see any other contaminants that would be linked to zinc and to these type of mine? Or let me rephrase it in a broader way. Based on spellrite and Galena, the two things that were mined for at the mine, which would be the main contaminants you would expect to see? And did you take into account for that when you decided which elements to look for?
What I can tell you is that there are several studies already done in those spring, which focus on zinc, which is the most abundant element in the water.
No, it's just it would have been nice. It usually requires a different technique, so sometimes you need to skip it, but it would have been nice if you had also looked at, for example, mercury, which is also more prone to biomagnification in your food chain. So
But I think mercury we did, but it's below the limit rotation. I don't want to be wrong, but I think we analyzed it. So.
Okay. Was it in the water or in the?
No, this.
Okay. So you also you say that towards the end of the discussion, you mentioned that unfortunately we cannot distinguish between consumption and prey turnover. Now, there's not a right or wrong answer in this, but knowing all that you have done by now, is this something you would do in a future step, or how would you, have you given any thought to how to overcome this in a future study, or to take this into account?
The turnover rates of invertebrates. This is a methodological limitation, I think, because you use a net that allows the entrance and the escape of macroinvertebrates. So I guess that the ones that are faster, can escape from the predator, and the ones that are more advanced, are more susceptible of being eaten by the predator. So it's very hard to determine the prey turnover inside the cages. Maybe if the study was focused on behavioral traits or morphological traits of organisms, you can have an idea of how this can affect. But in my case, I only focus on densities and biomasses. So.
Okay. And second to last question. Again, with the more global thing, or to speak in a non-scientific way about your results, what would, based on not just chapter 4, but all of your entire work, what would be your specific advice to more local stakeholders like Environmental Protection Agency, Water Agency, etc.? So not just in a scientific, but more concretely, should we add more fish? Should we reduce fish? Should we think about which cobbles are in there? That kind of thing.
Yes, the thing is that variation in fish density can lead to changes in ecosystem structure and function. So the message to take home is that because of climate change, because of anthropogenic stressors, this can lead to reduce the abundance of species, and this has an implication for the water management, because if the ecosystem structure and function is altered, you can probably expect changes also in ecosystem services.
Then the final question: where do we go from here? What would be your next thing to do after this?
Well, nowadays I'm looking for customers. Especially focused on ecophysiology of fishes.
And scientifically, what would be the next step, the next logical step to do after this thesis?
Well, the thing that I like most is the respirometry part, but I miss including, because my experiments were very descriptive, which are also important for characterization of the traits are important for the things that I miss including some environmental factors or investigating things that are more applicable to the aquaculture industry or to so ecological or evolutionary aspects.
Okay. Thank you, and thank you again for a really nice.
Thank you.
Okay. As my colleagues in the table, I would like to thank you and your supervisors to invite me to be part of this committee, this jury, and also the opportunity to read your work. I will do some questions, specific and general, as my colleagues. And then I would like to finish with a global evaluation of your work. Well, starting with the specifics, in chapter 3, you mentioned in the methodology that for the vertebrate you take the cage, inside the cage, you take a stone in order to sampling the community of vertebrates. But you also mentioned that you use a sorber for this. I don't understand very well why you use a sorber if you only measure the community in a stone.
Yes, because the dimensions of the cage did not allow us to sample with the survey, which this can also perturbate, you know,
Yeah.
So we collect string cobalt and then we scrape it and clean using the survey. That's why.
Okay, then the survey is only the net of the survey.
Exactly, it was to collect them and to make them.
Okay, but this is a problem to understand what we do. Okay. Well, also in this chapter, you mentioned that chironomids you classify as a collectors in general.
Yes.
But I don't know if in your community there were also families of the chironomid that are predators, like the Calicodina. Do you know if?
I know that this taxon is very diverse in feeding gills.
Yeah.
But well, I follow the shed table, no? The typical table that represents the different feeding gills with numbers. So I use the percentage. So it's an overall picture of the potential influences of chironomids on the ecosystem. But of course, I didn't accurate, no? Sub-level or species.
I agree that collectors are the most abundant in this group, but sometimes some species or some subfamily, the predator, is also abundant, and that was a question in order to clarify this.
Yes, I agree.
Well, in the chapter 4, you mentioned the activity of the fish as an engineer of the habitat. You mentioned this in the introduction. You also, this idea is also discussed at the discussion section. But despite that, this is also included at the title. I cannot find a good relationship between them because when you describe the objective and the hypothesis. In the hypothesis, you don't include biodiversity.
Yes.
And that I think this is a paper under revision. This is an
because following the food web classic theory, you expect that predatory species have strong effects by predation on invertebrates. And then this implies an indirect effect on verified environments, no? Like following a tropical scale. But what we found is that these species, even though that they are predators, can alter the verified environments through physical perturbation. And it is likely that these species, which feed on chironomids, so can perturb the phyton while eating. Also, the barrels, no? The species has barrels, so they are constantly foraging in the bottom of the stream, and this can generate perturbation.
Yes, I think it's true, and I think it's correct the discussion and so on. But if you, I think that if you include this idea in the title, that is that you want to report this activity, this effect.
Yeah, as I said, I'm currently in the process of review,
Yeah.
and this is one of the things that the reviewers criticize most.
Yes.
Because they say that, okay, ecosystem engineers can alter habitat, but this concept implies more things, no? I think that ecosystem engineers alter the physical habitat, but also other organisms benefit from this change. So I'm not saying that the Mediterranean barbel is not an ecosystem engineer, but based on our results, I can demonstrate this. So the reviewers suggest not saying that the Mediterranean barbel is an ecosystem.
Yeah, you can use the bioduration as a argument at the discussion, but neither including this idea in the title, because if you include this idea in the title, is because you want to demonstrate this, but at the end you use it, the bioduration, as a justification or as an argument for the discussion, but not. I think the experimental design is not to demonstrate this ability. That is, I think, it's confusing because you read the title and you think about another type of results or experiments. Well, also in this chapter, you include 2 sampling weeks, but I don't know if I hear something, but at the methods or the statistical data analysis, you don't include time as a factor.
As a random effect. Yeah, I use rate and treatment as fixed factors, and time and gauges as random effects in mixed effects models.
Well, that's great. I can see it, but if you say it's true. Okay, but no, because my doubt was which data did you work with the data of the second week or 4 weeks in an average of 2 weeks, but if you include 2 weeks separately, and then you include in the model that the factor time is random. Okay?
Exactly, yes. So it's a before and after design.
Before, after, but several times.
Exactly, we need to sample or not during the week.
Because in the other chapters you include that the ANOVA was repeating measures of ANOVA, but in this case it's
because it was a completely different design. Okay. For the general stream, I used the 3 types of treatments at the same time. So that's why we use the ANOVA analysis, and also the verified connected rate experiment was conducted at different times. That's why we use the repeated measures.
Okay, in the page 140, you say something. This is the beginning of the discussion. In this chapter 4, you say, as expected, the highest metal concentrations were found in regions impacted by both environmental stressors. But all your sites affected by metals are downstream the work, the hydrological pressure. Then I don't understand this sentence. Probably I have a problem.
Because low flows can compromise the dilution of metals. So our results agree with the fact that those stream bridges that were affected by hydrological alteration and metal pollution also show higher metal concentrations. So the same conditions of metal contamination, but with high flows, maybe these reflect another pattern of metal contamination.
Well, when you read this, it's difficult to understand because you don't have sites with metals and without hydrologic flow reduction. And then, well, it's a confusing,
No, I agree.
It's a confusing sentence. That's only to advise you to reduce the word from the second revision. It is okay. Well, also another recommendation for this chapter is also for the discussion in 146. At the conclusion, at the final part, and at the final part of the discussion, you mentioned the recommendation for managers, but you say this very general, without specific comments. You say, for example, we recommend the managers consider the importance of top traffic levels in decision-making processes. I recommend to be more specific and saying something more convinced. Okay. That is only a recommendation. Related with this, in the last part, in the general discussion, you have a section for the management applications, and I think it's really nice to read it. But I think that, for example, for the link between the results of the chapters related with the swimming capacity of the fish and the application for managers, for example, for the construction of fish passes and so on, it's more clear. But when you move to the ecological effects, this link is more difficult. You propose, if I'm not, it's correct, you propose to include in the biomonitoring system, biomonitoring activities, to include the functional feeding groups, not only the taxonomical classification and the use of biological indexes based on these taxonomical groups, and also you propose to measure the phosphorus uptake as another additional indicator of the functionality of the ecosystem. My question is, do you think that, especially for phosphorus uptake or this kind of measure, are there feasible for the managers? That is, they are prepared, it is easy to apply in a common biomonitoring system, this kind of new indicators?
Yeah, well, this is one of the most challenging things, that investigators has, how this knowledge can be transferred to managers in order to improve the water quality. What I suggest in the discussion is that sometimes structural responses do not or are not significant to anthropogenic expressions, but functional responses such as phosphate uptake rate or racers, which it's a functional feeding group, so it's based on what they eat. These kind of indicators can be more responsive to anthropogenic expressions. That's why I recommend also including functional responses.
Yes, I agree, and I have to say that several recent works are recommending the introduction of this kind of functional indicators like the feeding groups, for example, for the biomonitoring in intermittent rivers, that has an additional level that you go and you look at that the community are affected by the water stress or the water scarcity. And I think it's really important and necessary. And I think this indicator is really easy to apply because it's a transformation from the taxonomical data to functional data, and there are a lot of information about it. But for example, for the phosphorus uptake, protein uptake is not easy to apply in the short term because you need a more equipment, a specific equipment, an experience. That is my question. This was the way of my question. Okay.
Yes, well, it has improved that not phosphate, but nutrient integrated with phyton, and also under conditions of chemical stress, are good indicators in toxicity assessments. But of course, this methodology is more complex than only, well, it's not easy, but it's simpler, no, identifying an organism because you don't need so much equipment as compared.
Yeah, my last question is, you mentioned along the text some limitations of experiment to obtain better results. Especially for the experiments in the field, if you had the opportunity to do again, to repeat the experiment, what do you, or how do you change some experiment, some details of the experiment to get better results?
Well, this kind of experimental approaches are very hard to carry out, and you need many people involved in this because it's very hard to keep the experiment running. Also, you have to check every day. What could improve from based on my experience now? For instance, one of the things that came to my mind is that one of the reviewers of the 4th chapter says, why did you only use barbel in mesopause if also there is another species abundant in the stream? And sometimes the combined effects of both species is not the same that you are only testing one species. No? So maybe future experiment including both the species or no, this can be one option. Of course, increasing the length of experiment, but as I say, this is very time consuming, so I don't know if it's possible, but if there is one and human work, of course, increasing the length of experiments, including the seasonality, also the different hydrological conditions, you can get a big picture of what is going on in the streams. No? What else? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. As this is the last intervention, I would like to make a general evaluation of your work. Well, I think that your memory reflects an intensive work. This work is of good quality. The 4 chapters that you present, the main chapters, are manuscripts that have been already published, and one is under revision. And this is an important indicator of the global quality of your thesis. As you know, and as the professors and supervisors of the students, the PhD period is a training process to get experience and to mature as a scientist. And I think that your memory perfectly reflects this training. Also, the objective covered by this thesis is well-oriented and I think really pointed to solve knowledge gaps. I think that is very valuable the novelty of the experimental design. You include experiments in the field and in the lab that they are not so much extended because they are difficult, hard, as you mentioned before. And this, I think, is or show the ambitions of the work, not only for your part, but also for the part of your supervisors and also the team that are involved in this work. I think that you were conscious that your thesis had 2 blocks, as my colleagues mentioned before, but I think the work of the discussion at the end of the thesis tried to integrate them, and I think this is a good work on. What to finish, I have no doubt that many others will benefit from the results of this thesis. And finally, I congratulate for your answers in this presentation, in this defense, also for your work. Congratulations for your supervisors too. And well, it's been a pleasure to read the manuscript and to be here. And then we start the second part of this process that the committee discussed about the bags. It's the nervous of the last part. I forget if the supervisors have any questions or any comment to say here. No? And any doctor in the room want to make some questions to the candidate? No? Then, as I said before, the jury stay here in order to fill in all the documentation and to decide the mark. And please, if the public can go out.